So much, Mark. I really, really like the way you brought together so many of the different arguments and interpretations, and in a sense ranked them. And it might be worth just reiterating what you see as the driving force behind the Cold War, what you call this difference of viewpoints about the post-war world. There is one question from a number of teachers, Christina among them, about the role of ideology. Is that the space that you're emphasizing most?
Um, I think I would be cautious about putting too much emphasis on ideology in the explanation for the origins of the Cold War that I'm offering here. It seems to me these visions, as I've tried to describe them, were rooted in a kind of realistic sense of what the world needed to look like in order to promote the economic prosperity into the indefinite future, and to avoid new flashpoints that could lead to new wars. So certainly US and Soviet leaders approached these problems with a certain set of ideological blinders, if you like, predispositions. But I think that we should understand their thinking in kind of harder-headed terms. They were really thinking about what the world needed to look like in order to assure peace and prosperity as they understood it into the future. I think ideologically really becomes more significant a little on as anti-communism in the United States really revs up, and something analogous happens in the Soviet Union as well. Both sides sort of learn to look at each other through a more ideological lens as the cooperation breaks down, and these visions become increasingly the flashpoints for conflict.
Right, right. And I should say, I think that'll be one of the main topics that our friend and colleague David Oshinsky will talk about tomorrow. But as I understand your view of visions of the post-war order, you're emphasizing geopolitics then more
Yes.
than anything else, right?
Exactly.
So we have a number of questions, Mark, about the atomic bomb
Please.
and the role the atomic bomb played. Maybe would you like to elaborate more on the relationship you see between the atomic bomb and the origins of the Cold War?
Sure. As I said a few minutes ago, I think that the atomic bomb belongs, if we had a list of the top 6 reasons why wartime collaboration gives way to a Cold War, I would put the development of the atomic bomb on that list. It would be toward the bottom in my list, to put this somewhat crudely. Because I think these other explanations are so much more powerful. It seems to me that US-Soviet distrust, this is kind of a hypothetical, intellectual exercise that one could never prove, but it seems to me that if tension over the bomb or sharing nuclear secrets had been the only or one of a small number of points of contention between the United States and the Soviet Union, you don't get a big Cold War out of that. Partly because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Stalin knew all about the bomb project,
Right,
and
right.
so wasn't nearly as surprised and overwhelmed and threatened by the actual use of the bomb as has sometimes been suggested. But I do, as I say, I don't want to play it down too much. I think it's a question of getting the balance right. I think that indisputably, in the minds of some Americans, the bomb would be very useful not only as a way to end the war against Japan, but also to impress Soviet leaders with the fact that the United States had this unique technology and could wear it, as I think Henry Stimson said, ostentatiously on our hip to get its way in diplomatic conferences, to get its way in peace negotiations and so forth. Even though the Soviets had the Red Army, the United States at the end of the day had atomic weapons, and so could be the dominant voice in recreating the international order after the Second World War. The debate over the A-bomb and why it was used is one of those sort of endlessly interesting questions. And I think here, as with what I've been trying to describe in connection with the the origins of the Cold War, to my mind, a kind of satisfactory post-revisionist point of view has emerged over the years that acknowledges that, yes, this anti-Soviet motive was part of the calculation, and for some American policymakers might actually have been the most important. But as a generalization, I think it's fair to say that the principal reason for using the bomb was to end the war against Japan. But as as one of our former mentors, Jeremy, said, the use of the bomb, insofar as it would have an effect on Soviet behavior, was a bonus. You get that too. You don't have to choose. You get to end the war and impress the Japanese, but you also get a little knock-on effect with the Soviets saying, "Wow, that's a truly impressive piece of military technology, and we better watch ourselves as we try to challenge American power into the post-war period."
Just imagine, Mark, if we could have tweeted about the A-bomb. We've got this big bomb. Don't mess with us, right?
Exactly.
There are a number of questions, Mark, from John Stewart and a number of others about leadership changes at the end of World War II in this transition. You referred to this a little bit, but it's another one of those perennial questions. Frank Castiglione has just written a big book about this, as has Wilson Miscampbell. Would it have mattered if FDR lived longer? FDR certainly could have lived longer. He was the youngest of the three leaders. And of course, there's a leadership change with Churchill as well, Churchill to Attlee. What do we make, I think the teachers are asking, of these leadership changes and their effects on the origins of the Cold War?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, one that's kind of a counterfactual exercise that's so interesting to think about. What if FDR lives longer? My sort of gut instinct on that question is yes, it would have looked. I still think you get a Cold War, but perhaps a Cold War at a somewhat lower level of intensity that takes longer to come into fruition. On this point, I follow the logic of John Gaddis, someone also who and who everyone on this call should know is one of the great historians of the Cold War. In one of his books, he sort of charts the development of American policy toward the Soviet Union between about 1944 and 1947 in a way that really makes sense for me. So while FDR is still in the saddle, the emphasis is on quid pro quos and co-optation, right? If we do this for the Soviets, they'll realize, they can get along with us. They'll buy into our larger program. There was an aspiration for preservation of something of the wartime collaboration in a way that would make a real difference into the post-war period. Then FDR dies, and in comes Harry Truman, who A, doesn't know a lot of what FDR had done with respect to the Soviets, but B, was also a different sort of creature. I think it's fair to say less nuanced, less cagey, more direct. He's the buck stops here, Harry Truman, who wanted greater clarity in American policymaking. So he shifts to an approach of bargaining, right? He's going to drive hard bargains with the Soviets. He's still going to negotiate with them, but it's going to be on the basis of hardcore quid pro quos. But that doesn't really work. The Soviets don't really bend to American aspirations in any meaningful way. And so it's in that context that George Kennan comes to the fore, and the containment idea. And he's very explicit, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes. You can't bargain with the Soviets, forget that. You can only sort of oppose them over a sufficiently long period of time that they'll give up. And so I think Americans take a while to get to that containment phase, but that's the idea that really sticks. I do think if FDR lived longer, it would have taken longer to get there. It seems to me, again, this is such a sort of gut level feeling about these things, that Americans ultimately probably would have gotten there because the conflicts, as I've tried to describe, is at such a basic level that it's hard for me to imagine, something like the Cold War and something like a policy of containment not ultimately have taken shape.
Right. So there are a number of questions, Mark, about other actors in the Cold War, East European actors, Greece and Turkey. One of the trends, of course, in the scholarship, it's now kind of an old trend, right? It was a new trend when you and I were just starting out, right? And and of course we've made it the dominant trend, right? but a trend to sort of see non-American and non-Soviet actors as key actors. How do you recommend teachers think about that? About what role for East European, Czech leadership, Polish leadership, obviously the civil wars in Greece and Turkey. How would you work those in?
Yeah, very interesting. Let me say, first of all, that I am extremely sympathetic to this idea that we need to kind of get beyond the Soviet Union and the United States, maybe even China, and get deeply into the archives and experiences of other players. I think for many moments in the Cold War, it's absolutely pivotal and yields all sorts of really important insights that we missed. I would say, as a very broad generalization, though, that if your subject is the origins of the Cold War, the focus probably first and foremost needs actually to fall, as it normally has, on US and Soviet leaders. So I think the case for this kind of approach to the Cold War gets stronger as you move through time. I mean, let's face it, the United States and the Soviet Union, along with the British, had the seats at the conference tables. Most of the societies that get really interesting in later periods were devastated economically, physically, in many ways, in some cases. I'm not saying that looking carefully at the political dynamics within, say, a Poland or a Czechoslovakia or a Germany doesn't tell you something very interesting about the development of those particular societies and the ways in which the Soviets or the Americans pulled things or tried to recreate these societies on terms that would suit their larger interests. Those are all really fascinating stories. And certainly there were local actors who were very successful in kind of hitching their political programs onto the programs of the great powers. And that's oftentimes one of the reasons why their visions for their own countries prevailed. But as I say, I do think in the early period, it's the case that those voices were decisive in shaping the emergence of the Cold War is a little harder to make. Again, I can think of, so the Korean War and the role of, Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee is, an endlessly interesting place. You could probably make an argument that the behavior of those individuals really is absolutely pivotal to the fact that there was a war, much less in addition to the way the war actually played out. So, but that point may actually buttress what I was trying to say earlier. As you move a little bit down the road chronologically and opportunities emerge for peripheral actors to take the initiative, the world becomes more complicated. Americans and Soviets are trying to keep tabs on an increasing number of places, and those societies start to recover in some ways. There's much greater scope for what the question, I think, is getting at.
Right. So I want to ask a question that I'm going to try to ask of every one of us as presenters this week, because it's so much in the news today, and I think it's only fair as historians that we take contemporary questions and do try to look back while being honest to the history. What role did race play? I mean, you do refer to this a little bit in passing, right? And you've done a lot of work on this with regard to Vietnam, right? This is a world of empires the United States is entering into. And Roosevelt has these ideas of trusteeship, and this comes up even in the Atlantic Charter, which was one of the questions as well. Where, as an instructor, as a teacher, as a professor, would you bring discussions of race hierarchies, American views of race into this moment? Obviously not as the decisive factor you're saying, but it's certainly something that's there, as a lot of the scholarship has shown.
Yeah. I think that the documentary record is just full of race. It's everywhere you look. But I would also say this, that I think race in the period I'm talking about, and maybe there's a larger point to be made here as well, was used very instrumentally. So for Wendell Willkie in One World, he could reasonably say, we may be inclined to write off those crazy Bolsheviks, these people who come from a different culture. And there are other places in the book where he does similar kinds of things. But, at the end of the day, they're like us. We have to overcome these differences. And then later on, it would become perfectly acceptable to describe the communists as almost, a different race of humans, right? The Chinese communists were vilified for being racially other, in addition to being politically and geostrategically other, no question about that. But in the East Asian context, so fascinating in the early Cold War, where the power that had been vilified as the enemy, Japan, for a number of years becomes the partner and the ally, right, in a small number of years,
Right.
whereas the partner and ally, China, morphs into the enemy. There's, as I say, a kind of instrumentality, a kind of use of race to serve the larger geopolitical interests, which suggests, I think, a kind of suppleness, a kind of recognition that race is always there as something that can be exploited, but also a sophistication in using it to buttress whatever the geopolitical ambition is of the moment. And honestly, I'm not sure whether that should make us even more discouraged or maybe sort of strangely more encouraged to see that race can be used that way. I mean, it does suggest that it's not ironclad and fixed.
Right.
On the other hand, it suggests that it's always where you go first, in order to vilify a foreign society or a different society. So
Right.
I think it is something important to bear in mind, though, in the origins of the Cold War, maybe the whole Cold War, has a lot of reminders of how quickly attitudes change, how stereotypes can be flipped to apply no longer to this country, but now
Right.
to this country.
Right. Right. No, I think that's actually a really important teachable moment, that race matters, but how it matters will differ.
Yep.
As it does in our own world. It matters much more today than it did 3 months ago in our politics, right? It's not that it wasn't there 3 months ago. And so the way it matters varies. I think we're coming up on time.